for attending, everybody. So, as Zach said, we'll mostly do Q&A as per typical, but I think especially for this subject matter, it's best kind of delved into through Q&A because there's a lot of moving parts, a lot going on. But what is this trial? What is the significance of the trial for everybody on this call and for Unbounded Capital? So Kleiman versus Wright, it's ongoing. It's been in process since February of 2018. It's a civil dispute over upwards of $65 billion of value, making it one of the largest, if not the largest, individual civil IP case in history. The case is predicated on the suggestion that Craig Wright played a central role in the creation of Bitcoin under the pseudonym Satoshi. What the plaintiffs are alleging is that the deceased Dave Kleiman was his partner in this, and so he should be subject, or the estate should be subject to half of this value. Why it's especially significant for us and why we've been following it so closely is it offers a platform for Craig Wright to present evidence that he is Satoshi, which is certainly not the narrative in the cryptocurrency and tech space more broadly. And this could cause a narrative shift around his identity and by association around BSV, which could be very positive for both the price, but also the reputation of BSV or companies building on BSV. So far, we're a week and a half into the trial. These are the people who have testified. Everything that is not pointed to is just a video deposition that was played for the jury. So this is stuff that we've been privy to for a while. It's been on the public docket for over a year. So the new pieces of information are the information that came forward from Andreas Antonopoulos's interview, Patrick Page, Ira Kleiman, the plaintiff, and also CSW. So if you want to screenshot this or think about questions you have given who these people are and what their association is to the case, feel free, and I'm happy to discuss any of these depositions. So what new information have we learned thanks to the trial actually happening? One thing is just more details about Craig Wright and Dave's prior projects that were not Bitcoin related. There was always allusion to work that they had done together, but in this trial so far, we've seen evidence, a lot of government contracts. They were responding to RFPs from the Department of Homeland Security or intelligence agencies for projects pertaining to cybersecurity. A key piece of information from the deposition of Patrick Page was that Dave is not really a handshake guy. He's a buttoned up contract guy. So Patrick Page was Dave's best friend. They worked as police officers together and had business ventures together. And these business ventures, despite their close friendship, were very well documented. They had very detailed operating agreements. So this is kind of a significant juxtaposition that the defense will use for the lack of this type of evidence for a partnership with Craig Wright in the creation of Bitcoin. An interesting piece of information from yesterday's time with Craig Wright on the stand is that he said the Tulip Trust is an algorithm. So the Tulip Trust is a key entity in this case. It's the trust that Craig says has all of the Bitcoin that were mined by Satoshi, the famed Satoshi million Bitcoin, in addition to all sorts of other IP and Bitcoins that were purchased by Craig Wright in the early days. The idea that the Tulip Trust is an algorithm is a new idea. We've seen a pretty heavily redacted written version of this that's been on the docket for years, but its algorithmic nature might have implications on what could happen with Bitcoins being moved or being sold, especially these 1 million early Bitcoins that are known to be mined by Satoshi. So this is an interesting piece of evidence that may lend credence to one of our operating theories of the case, where during Craig Wright's time, or the defense's time rather, with Craig Wright on the stand, there could be an opportunity for Bitcoin to actually be moved or transferred that were kind of subject to this algorithmic trust as part of a kind of on-chain trust system, which we could talk more about in the Q&A, but this could be a very positive outcome for BSV and for Unbounded. Another piece of information from Craig Wright's time on the stand is that he and Dave worked on modeling Bitcoin with a supercomputer. So they were testing very large, even by today's standards, blocks around 300 gigabytes on a test net. So there was some evidence that looked damning against Craig about referencing to Dave mining. And Craig says that this is mining on the supercomputer. This is interesting for that reason, but it's also interesting because it may foreshadow some evidence that will come out during Craig's time on the stand. There's an exhibit list that's been presented to court, and one of the exhibits is called Time Chain V0.0.2 Alpha from 2008. And this may be a Bitcoin predecessor, which, if presented in front of the jury, would be very compelling evidence that Craig was involved in Bitcoin's creation and could have kind of a ripple effect for the narrative in the crypto space. So the summary of kind of what's played out so far. So we're still in the plaintiff's portion of the trial. The defense they've been able to, cross interrogate or speak with people that are being interviewed, but they haven't had their time to kind of present their case yet. So we're still in the plaintiff's portion. Their story is basically that, hey, look at all these emails between CSW and Dave, or all these things CSW has said in podcasts or in Slack or all over the place, where he's referring to Dave as, quote, my partner. CSW reached out to the Kleimans. This is like kind of how they know about Bitcoin. In the first place, he reached out after Dave's death and told them that Dave was involved in Bitcoin with him. And then really the only piece of evidence that originates from the Kleiman family is Ira recollecting this conversation with Dave at Thanksgiving dinner in 2009, where Dave tells him, hey, I'm working on this digital money. It's going to be bigger than Facebook. And he allegedly draws the B logo, the Bitcoin logo, for him. So the case from the plaintiffs is that, with all this evidence, it seems clear that Dave and Craig were partnered on the creation of Bitcoin, and were entitled to half of those Bitcoins as a result. The defense, again, they haven't presented this formally, but what it seems like they're angling towards is that it's true that Dave and Craig work together in other companies and projects, but not Bitcoin. I think they're almost certainly going to point to the lack of operating agreement or anything really concrete about a partnership in Satoshi, a partnership in creating Bitcoin and mining Bitcoin. And they're also, it seems like what might be the most compelling thing for Unbounded and our trades, kind of leaving aside the trial itself, is that the defense will be positioning themselves to show all sorts of data points from Craig, which really point to his role in Bitcoin's creation. So they've been asking a lot of questions of Ira for what evidence do you have? Do you have any notes of pre-Bitcoin planning or any kind of like pre-Bitcoin information that would point to Dave's involvement, of which there really is nothing. So it seems like the defense is setting up an opportunity for Craig to really present a lot of this information in court. And this is information that is not technical. It would be understandable to a layman, which the jurors are laymen. Things like receipts for the bitcoin.org domain prior to the Bitcoin white paper being hosted there, notes, prototypes like the time chain alpha, or any other thing that you would expect the inventor of Bitcoin to have to point to his involvement. So I think the defense will kind of set up, it's very clear from this information that Craig was involved. There's no operating agreement. The plaintiffs don't have any of this type of information for Dave. So it's very hard to claim that there was a partnership. This would be a great outcome. It's an interesting legal strategy, but it's also a great outcome for the purposes of shifting the narrative around Craig Wright, and that having a downstream effect of shifting the narrative around BSV. One significant out-of-court update actually came this morning. So Craig issued letters to major exchanges and BTC development groups, putting them on notice. So there's two different letters. The first letter is letting them know that they're misrepresenting BTC as Bitcoin. And the second letter has to do with the ownership of the Bitcoin database. So you can see here, this is language that was quoted in the article. So we don't have the actual document, but a source that had the document quoted this language. Since 2017, you've been using and encouraging the use of the database without a license or otherwise without Wright International Investment's permission. We therefore put you on notice that Wright International Investment intends to enforce its rights against you in respect of the Bitcoin blockchain database. So basically the claim here is that the Bitcoin code was made accessible via an MIT license upon release, but the database that's created with the Bitcoin code was not part of this license. So Craig's made allusions to other types of open source software that's put out there. You can't take the contents of that. You can use the software, but you can't, create. You can't like use the outputs of the software and claim it's something else. So these two types of notices in conjunction could lead to more interesting developments in the near term with what Craig's legal plans are kind of surrounding the Satoshi Nakamoto trial in Florida, but also kind of pertaining to Bitcoin and BTC. The parties that were given notice were Bitcoin.org, Square, BTC Core, the development group, Blockstream, Coinbase, eToro, and Kraken. A lot of familiar names here from a similar letter that was issued a year ago about the copyright on the Bitcoin white paper. So it's not so surprising, but a development that Craig has hinted at and seems to be kind of moving forward on, which is certainly noteworthy.
So it looks like we've got a couple questions. So Vincent, I see you asked this in the chat. What are the odds of an outcome where there's no court order to retrieve coins? I personally would say that doesn't seem like a probable outcome to me. Dave, what is your view in terms of if we had to handicap that outcome?
Well, I think this kind of gets to the trust being algorithmic and this kind of operating theory that we have around the case. So I'm going to try to make this not too technical, but basically there are complex scripts that you can create in Bitcoin. One of these scripts is basically like a time lock. So you say you can make a transaction and it has a maturation date that is a block number. And after this date, those Bitcoins are accessible. So Craig yesterday on the stand saying that the Tulip Trust is algorithmic could kind of lend credence to this idea that the Bitcoin are accessible through this type of transaction, maybe a different type, but kind of the same outcome. Where if that's the case, it's possible that this is only going to actually work on BSV because of things that were stripped out by the BTC developers or other development groups. So it's possible that there could be a scenario where, quote unquote, Satoshi Bitcoin, these early Bitcoins that everyone's kind of closely watching on the blockchain, they move, but they're only possible to move on BSV because of these changes. If that's the case, and we do see a movement like that either in court or shortly after, I think the idea that the vast majority of the value here, which is from the BTC since the price is so high, that's just inaccessible because these developers made these changes, I think would be really good grounds to kind of prove out this concept that Craig's put forward where code isn't law. So these things operate under a legal framework. The developers that are tinkering and making changes on the protocol are fiduciaries, and you can't just make a change that renders this contract worth $70 billion invalid. So if we're in a scenario where it's clear that Craig has these transactions, he can prove that on BSV. This is also in conjunction with all sorts of other evidence that he presents that, I'm Satoshi, I mine these coins. But then there's these, this like 70 billion worth of Bitcoin that's just kind of stuck. I think the only obvious path forward from that point is to have the courts intervene because that's an enormous amount of money. And there's no way to cryptographically kind of unlock it because of the changes. So I think that is a theory that we've been considering that is getting more likely as more information comes out. I don't think if that is what happens, I think it's unlikely that this $70 billion worth of BTC are just kind of lost because, well, sorry, the developers made changes and your trust is no longer valid. That seems unlikely. What could be possible is that none of that's gonna happen and there is no BSV movement, and then it's just kind of up to the court, like for whatever reason, Craig is unable to access these coins, and then it's just up to the court to compel miners to reassign these funds. I could see that, being kind of like a drawn out legal process or something that is hard to, this would be totally new territory as it pertains to Bitcoin, at least. So it's a possible outcome, but to me, it seems unlikely.
I think the odds of a court order happening from this trial actually moving coins are incredibly, incredibly low. So it's more about just, is there an outcome of this trial that then gets that process in motion, of which there'll be appeals, and it will be kind of a longer, drawn out legal process. But I'm kind of with Dave in the sense that whether it's this trial, whether it's even a legal case regarding Craig, or it's perhaps going after the hundreds of millions of dollars that we know are in like a Chinese fentanyl drug dealing wallet address, or like an Al Qaeda wallet address. These are addresses that are public, that are known. Chainalysis and other similar companies have done this diligence. So I think it's pretty naive by the kind of the crypto consensus to think that the same mechanisms that governments have built to telling banks, hey, if you have an account that we have proven or there's a court order saying that this is a drug dealer account and we need to seize these funds, to think that that won't ever be able to happen or is impossible with Bitcoin, I think is quite naive, and it's just kind of a matter of time before that happens. We have a earlier question that came through, which did the non-BTC Kleiman Wright companies have operating agreements? I believe so, but Dave, I'll refer that question to you as well. Are you aware?
Yeah, the main, so they did a lot of like white papers and research together, and these RFPs to U.S. government, stuff like that. But the main company is a company called Coin Exchange, which never really came to fruition. So Dave passed away before they kind of like executed on this, and it was going to be like a Bitcoin related exchange, presumably based on the name and based on things that Craig has said. But this is what Craig was offering shares to Ira Kleiman after Dave's passing. So he was saying, Dave had half of this company, and like these shares are for the estate, but there was really nothing in that entity. So I would have to go back on the docket, and I'm pretty sure these things are on the docket, but I can take a look. But yeah, I think the idea that Dave's previous companies with Craig or with other people were pretty buttoned up and executed on paper is like certainly what the defense is trying to establish.
I think one other element here is that Craig was under sort of intense audit from the Australian tax office. And apparently that office, they have like sort of a fraud department that gets paid on commission based on what they're able to recover through some sort of fraud conviction. And they had basically the result of that pressure from the ATO was that Craig, or his sort of story is that he transferred some of these companies to Dave, where Dave became kind of like the director, and he was compensated for being in that position. And then at a later date, those were transferred back to Craig. And I think that we are missing some details, which I think I would expect to continue to come out maybe today during the plaintiff's examination of Craig, or perhaps later on in the trial when the defense examines Craig. But I think that's where some of the dispute comes, is that there's not necessarily like an operating agreement about Dave being Satoshi or being part of Satoshi and being entitled to some of those coins, but Dave is involved in the paper trail behind some of these companies, such that without like greater clarity around why is Dave's name attached to some of these things and why were transfers between these entities done in the way that they were, it makes it much more plausible that Craig was doing something sort of deceitful with regards to not treating those companies the way that you ought to treat them, in a way that was disfavorable to Dave and his estate.
Yeah, there's a lot of new information coming out from Craig being on the stand. He's on the stand as we speak. It's day 3 of the plaintiff's time with him. So we expect to learn a lot more detail. There's been a lot of detail already given by Craig that wasn't available on the docket. So today, tomorrow, or I guess the rest of the week is off for the Veterans Day holiday. But Craig's time on the stand should yield a lot more detail and kind of piece together some of these pieces.
There's a question from, or in the chat, I know both sides have stipulated that Craig is Satoshi. Is there any chance that the court could affirm that in the final resolution? I don't think that there's going to be an opportunity for the jury, for example, to rule on whether or not Craig is Satoshi. And I don't know that like a jury ruling would necessarily be that valuable. I think what's more likely to happen is that, currently there's a case for Craig being Satoshi and a case against Craig being Satoshi. And we think that the case for is much stronger, but that there's evidence on both sides of that case. And this is not like a lawsuit type of case, but just, the argument as to whether or not he is. I think that what we're kind of expecting from the trial is that we're going to see more evidence that's extremely hard to explain from the Craig is not Satoshi standpoint, along the lines of receipts, research, early prototypes, these types of things coming out from Craig's activities prior to Bitcoin's release. And I think we're also going to see some of the case against Craig being Satoshi disintegrate. A lot of that, I would say that I would summarize the case against Craig being Satoshi is basically the following. The case is that Craig has not signed, and also there are a lot of things attached to Craig that are very suspicious and make him look like a liar. And therefore, it's extremely unlikely to Satoshi. It's in some ways that's not a bad case, and it especially was not as bad of a case 5 years ago when a lot less information was available. But I think that what we could see is that we could see a much more detailed explanation of kind of the origin of some of the documents that it's claimed that Craig, fraudulently altered, such as emails or legal agreements. And they're, Craig's side of the case is basically saying that his systems were compromised and that the ATO was also responsible for altering documents, and that the person at the Australian Tax Office who was in charge of his case was ultimately relieved because he was tampering with evidence. We kind of see that evidence or the incentive to tamper from the fact that those tax officers were, being compensated via commission. And, right now it's fairly convenient that Craig gets to sort of hand wave away some of these things that look bad for him by just saying I was hacked, or that these were tampered with by the Australian Tax Office, or even he's implied that some things were tampered with by Ira Kleiman. But we have been led to believe and think it's likely that during the defense's part of the trial, we're going to see a much more detailed explanation that accounts for some of these irregularities in Craig's paper trail. And I think that this sort of two-sided narrative shift, one side being additional evidence that Craig is Satoshi, the other side being an explanation that sort of refutes some of the commonly cited counter evidence towards Craig not being Satoshi, that the combination of those could be extremely powerful for the broader thesis that Craig Wright is Satoshi.
Speaking of evidence, kind of explanations of what this fraud originates from or why there's so much fraud around Craig, in the vein of Ira Kleiman being kind of a shady character also. So new evidence came forward. He testified to operating over 30 email addresses. And a lot of these email addresses have names that are like borderline. It's pretty clear he's trying to like identify other people. So one email address was kleimanwright@gmail.com and stuff like this. And he's sending emails back and forth with the IRS or the ATO under these various email addresses. So yeah, I think from our sources that are closer with the case and that are in Florida, they said that the defense is very confident that they'll be able to rebut the claims of fraud against Craig in a very compelling way for the jury. And they may even wait for their time to present the case, as opposed to presenting that during the response to the plaintiff's time with Craig on the stand. So we'll have to wait and see.
There's a question from Dustin. For purposes of the trial, why is Craig trying to prove he is Satoshi? Doesn't that hurt his case? I think that it's kind of impossible from the standpoint of the trial. I don't think he can necessarily very easily say, I'm just not Satoshi. He'd be countering like a whole ocean of evidence that already exists, which points to him being Satoshi, including him saying that he is Satoshi with emails with Ira Kleiman. So I don't think that's necessarily an option. But in terms of the degree to which you would want to provide further evidence or not provide further evidence, where that further evidence might result in it being more likely that he ends up owing Bitcoins to Dave Kleiman or Dave Kleiman's estate, I think that it's pretty clear based on their communications, and when I say they, I mean Craig and kind of the team around him, that they see this trial as an opportunity to get this evidence into the public through a court, which is their preferred kind of avenue for presenting this evidence. And we've seen, like, through today's announcement, targeting these exchanges for passing off BTC as Bitcoin and things that he's done over the past couple of years, that this seems to be a coordinated part of a broader legal strategy. And even though this case wasn't initiated by Craig, I think that they're using it as an opportunity to set up one of the sort of important pieces in this broader legal strategy.